I always prefer starter builds that have a lot of room to min-max. I don't want to build like Ignite Detonate Dead. That's pretty much equally good if you put 20x or 200x into it. I also don't want to build that really feels like it's just assembling a bunch of unique items, where you don't get to wear many rares, and that's because I enjoy crafting items, and especially crafting my own gear. For 3.18 in particular, I wanted a build that was good at farming, something I could use to easily complete my atlas. After that, I could just blast some maps, and of course, I want it to be all content capable. So how did that work out? Well, I've done 100% delirious mapping, some casual delving, killed the feared, and all non-Uber bosses. In terms of Uber bosses, I've thrown in some attempts, and I've had mixed successes, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Corrupting Fever Gladiator offers extremely consistent damage, especially if you're applying Corrupting Fever with Kinetic Blast or Tornado Shot. I wouldn't say this build is for everyone. It's a bit of an acquired taste in terms of maintaining the buff on yourself constantly. You also need to pay close attention to your defenses, because it's easy to get carried away focusing just on your damage and end up feeling far too squishy for comfort with the new Arch Nemesis mods. But I've also had a ton of fun crafting my gear using recombinators. I was able to sell failed crafts and old gear very easily, since it overlapped with other people playing Corrupting Fever, and also sometimes Fizz Trappers. The last time I played Corrupting Fever was in Ultimatum, and I generally prefer to play new things, but we haven't really had much in the way of new skills for the better part of a year now, which means I'm running out of good options. And so that's definitely part of the reason why I'm still playing this build after 3 weeks, but another reason is I've just had a lot of fun with it. It's felt really good to play, and it's been super strong. But now let's get into it. How does this build work anyway? To start off with, I'm going to go over some core mechanics, including the question that I'm sure will be asked the most: Gladiator versus Champion, or more likely, why aren't you playing Champion? The simple answer is Bleedsplode. The more complicated answer is Gladiator has higher damage and better speed, along with a less annoying playstyle because you don't have to constantly spam yourself down to half health to maintain your adrenaline. It's also easy enough to use Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame to grab Fortitude, which really is the best part of Champion. This is also a great way to get the benefit of Bleedsplosions without having to use an Explodey Bow, Explodey Chest, or sacrificing your glove slot for Hemophilia. Another question I got a lot was, why are you using Volley over grid or multiple projectiles? I got asked this so many times that I made a video to explain the differences between the two supports, and when you might use one over the other. If that interests you, be sure to check it out in the card. But if you want a shorter answer, maybe a TLDR, I'm using both, because I want to generate as many projectiles as possible for as many hits as possible. This way I get to full stacks of Corrupting Blood much faster on single target. Hits are also why I have Awakened Chain in my Tornado Shot links, since it doesn't matter how much damage my Tornado Shot deals, it just matters how fast I can hit stuff. If you're going to use Volley, then be sure to use Divergent Greater Volley, as the projectile speed from quality is quite nice. And finally, before I get into the gearing more, how does Corrupting Fever work? Again, for a full detailed explanation, I have a dedicated video which will be in the card. For a quick explanation, Corrupting Fever is a buff on you. You spend life to use it, and this can get quite expensive. So if you're using Life Tap, consider using Anomalous Corrupted Fever to reduce the costs. This buff will refresh itself after you've spent enough life, so you don't really have to spam it. When you hit an enemy, you'll inflict a stack of Corrupting Blood. Corrupting Blood deals physical damage over time, but is not a bleed nor an ailment. This means Fizz.multi and physical damage will scale it, but ailments deal damage faster will not. Luckily, most enemies don't have a lot of defenses against physical damage over time, so you'll often find that Corrupting Fever outperforms its POB numbers. Since you do still need to hit the enemy to apply it, enemies that block will prevent Corrupting Blood stacks, and you'll want something like Resolute Technique so you don't have to worry about accuracy. Be aware, if you roll buffs expire faster as a mod on your maps, it can feel pretty bad. And this is also where I have to mention, Corrupting Fever is a bit of an acquired taste. It can feel really satisfying to keep the buff maintained, and it can also be a little bit annoying to feel that need to attack or use your Tornado Shot during downtime, whether you're mapping or bossing. As a result, this skill won't be for everyone. But if it is for you, well, what are some of the items that can help when you're playing it? I first want to call out Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame, and Impossible Escape. Flesh and Flame get me Fortitude, I know a lot of people have been taking Champions Inspirational, since this can fix mana reservation, and it can also add damage. But it's not always about damage. I paid 2.5x for these jewels early on, and to be honest, I wish I'd done it sooner, because it adds so much more defense and comfort while both bossing and mapping. The reason I'm using Impossible Escape, targeting Iron Will, is this is a great way to grab a lot of high-value notables for a few passive points. This frees me up to invest in 3 large clusters, which I'll talk about later. I'm also using Ashes of the Stars, which, again, isn't the best damage option. A +1 all, +1 fizz dot multi-amulet would definitely be my best damage option. It might cost a little bit less, and it would be way more fun to craft. Though I would probably need to take Tireless at that point to deal with the increased cost on Corrupting Fever. Ashes also does give mana reservation efficiency, which is by itself a lot of quality of life. And my favorite part of Ashes is it enhances the quality of all my alt quality gems. Attack speed on Tornado Shot, more projectiles on Frenzy, even a lower cooldown on Flame Dash, and armor from Anomalous Flesh and Stone. If you're looking to drop Ashes, it definitely can be replaced, be it because you want to use a rare, you want more damage, or you simply can't afford it. But you shouldn't do it without thinking about the consequences. If you have less mana reservation efficiency, you might want to use Essence of Loathing to roll a helmet, or alternatively, you could replace Flesh and Stone with Blood and Sand. Blood and Sand won't directly increase your damage, but you really want to run a stance skill if you're going to have Arena Challenger, as sitting in Blood Stance, your default stance if you don't have a skill, is going to feel really awkward when you're only able to get Challenger charges by hitting rares and uniques. So I like to be able to stance and hop into Sand Stance to go fast while mapping. Another way to add a lot of damage is Circle of Guilt. You could either use 1 like I am, or 2 if you need more damage from your rings. Personally, I feel like 2 is a little bit greedy given the rest of my gear. I'd probably have to drop a Cluster Jewel and take more life on my tree and maybe some res to facilitate that. But if I had something like a Mage Blood, or I really didn't care about my deaths, then I could see running 2 for more damage. I could also see an argument to be made to run none at all, since while damage is good, sometimes you need to focus on defenses, especially if you're playing the build in hardcore. But I'd still be hesitant to give it up. It's a lot of damage, and you can get some with really good rolls such as life gain on hit, Determination Aura effect, or maybe even vulnerability on hit if you're really lucky or just like wasting money. Something else that I found it difficult to replace was Maloney's Mechanism. I went into it thinking, oh, it's just a quiver with life and attack speed. I mean, triggering a gem is nice, but how good could it be? And every time I tried to rework my build, I couldn't find a way to drop it. Socketing Frenzy in combination with Anomalous Maim and Culling Strike is just so much damage that it feels pretty irreplaceable. And the life and attack speed aren't that bad either. If you want a more defensive quiver, then something like Rearguard might be your best bet, but I found it pretty hard to justify giving up the damage, at least if I wanted to keep a bow. At that point, I felt like I'd be better rebuilding the character to use 1 in shield, though that would be a topic for another video. Finally, if you're going to play this build, do you need a Headhunter? No, you don't. I would advise at least adding an Inspired Learning, which can be placed in the Marauder socket. And it is true that Headhunter is an amazing defensive tool, which will make you far tankier. But you don't need it. You're not going to be using a Headhunter or Mage Blood when you League start like I did. And if you want to use a rare, something like a Mage Blood at home, a really cool crafting project that I talked about in a recent video, check the card for more info, is easily good enough for all content. Now, if you're running juice content, especially with Beyond or Delirium, then your goal should be to get a Headhunter. You don't need it for this, but it makes the content way smoother and way faster. And if your build's already able to handle content like that, it shouldn't be too hard to farm the money that you need. On the other hand, if you really want to focus in on bossing with this build, I suggest making a Mage Blood your goal. Switching to a Mage Blood and using Resistance Flasks or Max Res on Tree in combination with Melding of a Flesh will help a lot when mitigating the elemental damage dealt by bosses, something that's definitely this build's weak point. Having permanent flasks will also let you use things like flask suffixes to augment your recovery, which is this build's other weak point. But I don't really suggest farming uber bosses on this build, so I'm not sure building around bossing is something I'd advise. Next up, I'd like to take some time to talk about the rares I'm using, go over how I crafted them, and a little bit on why they have the stats that they do. But before that, a quick reminder that if you're enjoying the video, and you've made it this far, be sure to leave a like. I'm also going to be talking about recombinators in the near future, and going into some detail about how to craft with them optimally. So if that interests you, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when I upload that video. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members for their continued support. If you prefer reading and want to go through a summary of this video at your own pace, you can do so by becoming a patron for $5 a month. But don't worry, the info won't be any different from what's here. And now, let's start talking about rares and crafting. For my weapon, the goal was to add as many levels as possible to both Corrupting Fever and Empower, which added more levels to Corrupting Fever. To facilitate this, I wanted +1 to level of socketed gems, +2 to socketed supports, and if I could get it, .multi, phys.multi, or physical damage over time. To do this, I started by recombinating a 6-link shortbow from the Porcupine card. Normally this is item level 50, and I needed 82. So I merged it with item level 100 bases until I got the item level 90 base that I'm using now. From there, I recolored it by turning all the sockets red, rolling 3 reds, and then using Harvest non-red to red, and finally applying the Harvest random green and blue socket to get red-red, red-red, blue-green. I now had my off-colored, high item level, low dexterity base. From there, I used a crafting method that's been around a while, alt-spamming to roll .multi, then meta mods with cannot roll attack and multi-mod to force the physical damage over time and the +1 gems. For more details, check the video in the card where I go over this crafting method. After making the weapon, I needed armor. This was both my biggest goal and also a very trying task. Since I wasn't getting just good gear, I wanted outright greedy and one could argue stupid gear. Which is to say, I wanted armor bases with spell suppression on them. My secret weapon here, recombination. For full details on how I was recombinating this stuff, check out one of my recent videos, which will be in the card. For my gloves, I just bought them. I got T1 spell suppression, life, chaos res, and it worked out pretty well. I then added the Eldritch implicits, since physical damage over time multiplier adds a significant amount of DPS, and suppression was needed to reach a 100% cap. I then used a double fractured pair of boots. Since I wanted suppression and move speed, I wanted the suppression to be fractured so that I could reroll it, and I wanted to use Essence of Loathing. The reason I needed the suppression to be fractured is I was using Essence of Loathing, and I wanted it to roll on an armor base. This was a very greedy project, and I did it early on. If you're trying to reproduce it today, it would probably cost you 50 or 60x. Don't do this, don't be greedy, don't aim for the armor base. Just get any old pair of suppression boots, roll them with the essences until you get other good items, and then use suffixes can't be changed plus veiled chaos to get 30% move speed to fix your prefixes. From there, you'll want chance to avoid, which you can elevate with orbs of conflict. This way, you'll get most of your avoidance here from the boots, and you can fix the rest with your chest piece. Unfortunately, it does need to be the highest tier of avoid on the implicit. It's annoying, but well worth it. And then for my chest piece and helmet, I did a pretty similar process on both. Taking the mods that I wanted, in the case of a chest, suppression, in the case of a helmet, the delve mod and suppression, and recombinating them together. Originally, I'd wanted a Guadalitsi chest with Ashling for the prefix to avoid ailments on my chest piece. Unfortunately, I tried about 14 times and failed the Ashling on all 14 of them. After that, I just kinda gave up, I kept this one, and I called it good enough. For the helmet, if you're not too worried about phys damage, then you don't absolutely need the physical damage taken as elemental, which makes the recombination a lot easier. In fact, you could even use Essence of Loathing for mana reservation efficiency if you're not using ashes. I then fixed my helmet's prefixes with an Eldritch Chaos, and fixed my very brick chest piece by doing suffixes can't be changed plus veiled chaos until I actually got the Eleavoid. The Ashling had eaten my Guadalitsi life and given me 10% life back, which was very rude of it. Thus, I ended up with cap suppression, high armor, and near perfect Eldritch implicits. As a quick call out, you don't specifically need Malevolence on your chest. In fact, Determination's better defensively, and Pride might be more damage. But I was so exhausted after the process that I went with what I happened to roll. For my clusters, I'm using 3 larges and 6 mediums. I rolled the larges with Jagged Fossil and Harvest Reroll Fizz. For the mediums, I did a mix of Harvest Reroll Chaos, Aberrant Fossils, and just buying them outright since they weren't too expensive. I also purchased my vulnerability on Hit Ring, as originally I'd planned to craft on a synthesized base, but this one popped up for cheap on a live search, it solved all my problems, and I was at a point where I didn't really feel the need to improve my gear further. And so, should you play Corrupting Fever, either as a league starter or as a farming build? I'd say the build isn't for everyone. Maintaining Corrupting Fever is either going to fall into a satisfying rhythm or a perpetual annoyance. And while the build does have a reputation for sucking at bossing, it's not that bad once you get, let's just say around 50 exalts or so in gear. I'm always hesitant to put numbers on that, since 50 exalts when I spend it could easily be 20 when someone else does, or 250. But once I did have the investment, I found that bosses like Cirrus, Uber Elder, and Cortex, or even Afeard, were very smooth and very easy. There were certain things I had to dodge, but even when I failed at dodging, my defenses, mainly through fortitude and suppression, were enough that I usually didn't die. Originally, I approached this build with the expectation of being able to farm Uber bosses. They were advertised as being a similar difficulty to the Afeard. The problem is, they require a lot more recovery. Even with some practice, and even with trying to minimize my hits, I'd advise a build with higher recovery if Uber bossing is your goal. It's not that the build can't do it. In fact, with a Mageblood, I'm sure it can very well, but it's not going to be too comfortable. On the other hand, if you're doing mapping, if you're doing delving, or if you want to clear delirious maps, then this build is an excellent choice and it feels absolutely amazing. If I was unhappy with a performance, I really wouldn't be playing the build 3 weeks into 3.18. I've done a ton of content on this build, and for the most part, it's been great. In fact, I've even rediscovered the joy of farming legions, something that I thought I lost way back in 3.7. The build could even be a little bit too good, which is to say, I've sometimes struggled to use sentinels, especially once I got pretty good gear, cause if I didn't hold back, I'd kill a majority of the enemies before the sentinel even got a chance to empower them. And then, how does it deal with arch-nemesis mods? Incredibly well. In fact, it's relatively unaffected by most of them. You're negating resistances, and you're negating armor, so it's only the things that have physical reductions that are really an annoyance. Even before the adjustments to arch-nemesis, once I grabbed my fortitude node, I didn't really have that much trouble. So, is Corrupting Fever Gladiator something that can be played from day one, and min-maxed all the way through 3.18, including taking down the Feared quickly and smoothly? Yes, absolutely. If that's your goal, and the playstyle seems for you, Corrupting Fever Gladiator is a great choice. But what do you think? Does this build look up your alley? And how does it compare to your 3.18 starter? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, be sure to put them down in the comments below, or join the Discord, where you can ask questions, get build help, and hang out with the community. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. They're awesome, and they get to show it by having their name on screen in the credits of all my videos. So if you want to see your name here, be sure to check the link in the description. For more general gaming content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts, and if you want a water bottle or a cool shirt, I have a link to my official merch shop in the description. I hope you learned something today, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.